been a couple of weeks. We are in our Siddur Sim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals. And we are after the Haftarah. And we spoke last week about blessings for kind of some extra blessings that are thrown in during the Torah service. We finished all of our reading from scripture. And so this is a good time, an auspicious time to be asking for blessings. And so we looked at the Yakum Porkan blessings, and then the Misha Berach. So these are all blessings for the community, people who support the community, scholars in the community, etc. And then we spoke about the prayer for the country. So, and we saw that this is a tradition that goes way back, perhaps as far back as Jeremiah in the very first exile, where Jeremiah tells the departing Jews to pray for the well-being of the cities in which you live, because your fate will be tied in to the fates of those cities. And then we saw in medieval times or late medieval times how a kind of a formal prayer developed, where we in fact did that, kind of had a mix of pledging, almost like pledging loyalty to the government, along with calling for blessings, and that they should rule justly, and et cetera, and with kind of a messianic thing. So that's all well and good, but then we get to page 149 in our Siddur, and you'll see at the top of the page it says a prayer for the state of Israel. I also have it on screen. It might be a little small to see all of that. 1948 comes along, and Israel is established, fights the War of Independence, but now is a nation, right? So no longer, for the first time in 2,000 years, no longer do Jews have to be in a situation of professing their loyalty for the non-Jewish authorities who are ruling over them, and pray for their well-being so that things go well for us as well. So now we've got autonomy in our own land. So this prayer for the government is just not going to work anymore. So one of the first religious acts that is undertaken is the composition of a new prayer. And that's what we have here on the top of page 149. Actually, on top of page 149, you'll see there's just one paragraph of it, whereas on my screen, there are two or even three paragraphs. And that is because the conservative movement, for whatever reason, chose only to include the first paragraph. And so we can perhaps consider why that might be. But let's look a little bit about the history of this prayer. So it's 1948, and the rabbinic authorities in Israel know that we need something new to acknowledge this, and of course at that point, in terms of the observant kind of Jewish establishment, you have some Orthodox Jews who are Zionist. Probably most are not, right? Most are not particularly excited about Israel. And in fact, the numbers of Orthodox Jews living in Israel in 1948, or at least that were kind of involved in this project to make a new state, is very small. It's very heavily dominated by secular Israelis. But perhaps borrowing a legacy from the British, they do establish the rabbinate, kind of so in the official representative of Judaism for the state, and along with it they establish a chief rabbi, but actually not just one chief rabbi, two chief rabbis, right? We need an Ashkenazi chief rabbi and a Sephardi chief rabbi. And to this day, we still have that. We have both chief rabbis, and they are, I guess Shlomo, maybe you could fill in a little bit more on this, but they are the heads of the Rabbanut establishment in Israel. I suspect this was, well, not suspect, this was never Ben-Gurion's intention for it to play out the way that it has played out, but the Rabbanut has a big chunk of government funding every year to run all of the things that the government funds. So Shlomo, I don't know if you want to have anything to fill in on the
No, you're right, but it's interesting because at the time of the establishment of Israel, Ben-Gurion agreed to give exception from the army to study Torah. It was probably for a few hundred, young people, religious guys. Today, it's around 100,000.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And Ben-Gurion thought that they were essentially going to go away. Right? He didn't think that they were going to become a major force in Israeli political life, but here we are. So, all right. So where did this prayer come from? Well, it came from this piece of paper. Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, and he composed the prayer on this piece of paper. So let me see if I can read what it says. At the top, it says Tfilah L'Shlom Medinat Yisrael, which is a prayer for the well-being or for the peace of the nation of Israel. Let's see. Ulaha Omer Al Yedei Harav.
It's hard to read.
It's hard to read, right? And then it says, Acharei Kriyat HaTorah, so they're like, after the reading of the Torah. Can't read the rest of that. But anyways, he launches in right there. Avinu Shebashamayim Tzur Yisrael Yoshio V'Goalo. A little different than what we have now. Barech and Medinat Yisrael Reshit Tznichad Geulatenu Hagen Aleha Be'evrat Chasdecha
Fros, yeah.
V'fros Aleha Sukat Shlomecha V'shlach Orchav So it's pretty much the same as what we have today in our Siddur, although he continues on and there's a second paragraph down here. So he writes this in 1948, but he didn't write it by himself. He had an editor. Shlomo, do you know who his editor was?
No.
Right. His editor was Shai Agnon.
Huh.
All right. So, and this is Shai Agnon's handwritten edit of the prayer for the state of Israel. I'm not even going to try and read that; it's very small. But so we have the great Israeli writer Shai Agnon. So, and then it gets released September 20th, 1948. And it's published in a couple of newspapers. Here's one of them, a newspaper called Hatzofeh. You can see on the right side, this is the front page. And then the left side is where the prayer appears. And if you, let's see, you don't see my arrow. Let me get a pointer. Right here, this is where the prayer appears in the article. All right, and so this is a close-up. So this says, Maranan v'Rabbanan harabanim harishonim le'eretz Yisrael. So our masters, our teachers, the first rabbis of the land of Israel, Hagon, Rav,
Yarim Oro,
Herzog, Hagon, Rav, Beitin Tzedek, Uziel. So these are the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi chief rabbis of Israel. B'haskamat Chavrei HaMoatza v'Rashei HaRabbanim Shel Tel Aviv. So with the agreement, was it Chavrei HaMoatza? Was it the members of the Knesset?
No, it's like a committee.
Okay, so the members of the committee and of the rabbis of Tel Aviv, the chief rabbis of Tel Aviv, Haifa, Petach Tikva, Shlita. So this is, they got the agreement from the rabbis of Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Petach Tikva. Yasdu v'tignu et tefillah shelahen. They established and affixed this prayer, lahalan, this prayer that follows. Lehamar b'chol batei knesset ba'aretz uvitfutzot. It should be said in all synagogues in the land and in the diaspora. Al yidei harav. So Yud, I'm not sure what that is. Hashaliach tzibor, right? So it should be said either by the rabbi or the shaliach tzibor, the person leading services. B'shabbatot of moadim, on Sabbaths and on festivals. Acharei kriyat haTorah, after the reading of the Torah, right? So this is where it first appears, published in the paper, and then it launches into the prayer right here. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barech Eminat Yisrael. Exactly the same prayer that we have to this day. So is that surprising?
That it shows up in a newspaper?
Shows up in the paper, yeah.
I guess I didn't expect there to be a regular newspaper as early as 48. Everyone's busy fighting the War of Independence, and everyone's speaking Hebrew already. I don't know exactly when Eliezer ben Yehuda did his work, but clearly people are reading this.
Eliezer ben Yehuda was turn of the century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
it
yeah.
makes
I noticed that this is not on the front page. It looks
Sorry?
like it's buried. It's not on the front page. It looks like it's buried in
It's buried.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't pop, right. What was the nusach back then for that paragraph?
The nusach, I don't know.
It's so beautiful today. I was just wondering where that came from.
I have heard, so in addition to the one that Moti introduced to us, which has become very widespread in the Jewish world, I know of one other melody for the prayer for Israel. Yeah, I suspect that the rabbis didn't have a melody in mind when they first wrote it. But we have lots of.
Well, were they planning on the rhymes, or is that just a consequence of the grammar? Because there is rhyme and rhythm to it.
Yeah, well, let's look at it a little more. All right, so this is the full one that is composed. All right, so let's look. Avinu Shebashamayim, which is our Father in heaven. Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo, so Rock of Israel and its Redeemer. We say Barech Eminat Yisrael, so bless the state of Israel. So Medina, this is a political entity, right? Reshit tzmichat geulateinu. We'll talk about that phrase shortly. So Reshit is the beginning of, tzmichat is the blossoming or the flowering, and geulateinu is redemption. So the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. Hagen aleha be'evrat chasdecha. So what you're looking at is the pronominal possessive suffixes. Okay. Not possessive, not possessive. Well, sorry, some are possessive, some are not possessive, right? Hagen aleha, which is guard upon it. Be'evrat chasdecha. What is evra?
Evrat is a difficult word. I don't even know what it means.
Yeah. So this translation is surely with your loving kindness. They're combining two different phrases. So something to do with your kindness, but chasdecha is your loving kindness. But so the cha ending and the aleha ending have a rhyme. So I suspect that that's intentional. Ufros aleha, spread upon it, sukat shlomecha, the shelter or the canopy of your peace. Ushlach orcha, and send your light, va'amitcha, and your truth, l'rasheha, to its leaders, right? So I guess they're playing with the ha and the cha, right? So ha would be its, and cha is you, upon you, but they have a rhyming sound to it. And then sareha v'yoatzeha. So sareha is its officers, v'yoatzeha and its advisors. V'taknem be'etzat tova lefanecha, and establish them with good counsel from before you. Chazek et yidei megine eretz kodshenu, strengthen the hands of those who protect our holy land. V'hanchilem Eloheinu Yeshua, and may our God grant them deliverance. Va'ateret nitzachon ta'atrem, and a crown of, a crown of glory, glorious victory, or something like that. Ateret nitzachon is a crown of victory. Ta'atrem is crown them with a crown of victory. V'natata shalom ba'aretz, and place peace in the land. V'simchat olam liyoshveha, and eternal joy for its inhabitants. So that's our prayer. Quite different than what we saw earlier with the prayers for the governments that were in our Siddurim for centuries before that.
It's interesting why the conservative movement chose that paragraph and skipped the one that God will bring.
Well, yeah, okay, so let's look at this one.
Israel.
So the next one begins, Vet achenu kol beit Yisrael, and our brothers, the entire house of Israel. Lead them swiftly and upright to your city, Zion, and to Jerusalem, the abode of your name, as is written in the Torah of your servant Moses. Even if your outcasts are at the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you. From there he will fetch you. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land that your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and more numerous than your fathers. Draw our hearts together to revere and venerate your name, and to observe all the precepts of your Torah, and send us quickly the Messiah, son of David, agent of your vindication, to redeem those who await your deliverance. Manifest yourself in the splendor of your boldness before the eyes of all inhabitants of your world, and may everyone endowed with a soul affirm that the Lord God of Israel is king, and his dominion is absolute. Amen, forevermore. All right, that's the paragraph that's not in our Siddur. So, any theories as to why?
It's not in the Reform Siddur either, but I can understand that.
What do you mean by that, Michael?
This is very messianic and nationalistic, and the Reform Siddur tends to reject that. David, the kingship of David, all of that.
Yeah. The conservative Siddur does not get rid of references to David and Mashiach, though. Those certainly appear. We saw this in the Amidah. We still have the prayer talking about a return of the Davidic kingdom.
This does seem to be
right? Cause the shoot of your servant David to blossom.
This does seem to be calling for almost military action to take over Jerusalem. And
you see a militaristic aspect to this?
I don't. I thought it's kind of putting that on God, but I could see that because this is explicitly more political than the Amidah, which is a bit more aspirational, that this could be misconstrued.
Yeah, I mean, the references to Jerusalem are interesting. I mean, think about what the status of Jerusalem was in 1948. Right? It was a divided city. And, the Jews did not have the old city, right? They did not have the Temple Mount.
It seems like it's also calling for kind of an ingathering of the diaspora.
Yeah.
Right. And so if anyone who thinks that we'll put it to you this way, why haven't we all made Aliyah? Because we think that there's some legitimacy in being in the diaspora. And I wonder if our ancestors would be shocked at that you have the opportunity to go back to Israel and you're not going.
Yeah.
Or a moratorium so that it wouldn't get too crowded.
Although we have other references to that in our prayer book, right? In the V'kabetzenu merabak and foda aretz. So we say this right before the Shema. God, bring us together from the four corners of the earth.
It's poetic.
So
ותולדותינו קוממיות לארצנו.
yeah, bring us upright
All right.
into our land.
So do they get rid of it because it's duplicative? I keep trying to find the thing that stands out, but if we can't find anything else, if all of this is elsewhere in the Siddur, then we're left with, well, we don't need it because we already said it.
Well, there also may be a difference between something that is ancient and has been in our Siddurim for many, many centuries, as opposed to something that's new.
You know, I think it's the conservative movement, maybe, I don't know, but maybe it's to avoid this kind of conflict, because there are many people in diaspora feel comfortable, and a big portion of this blessing talks about, you know, it's about maybe 1/3, talks about returning all the Jews back to Israel, back to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the conservative movement has always recognized the importance of a strong diaspora community as well, right? So, so maybe we don't want to overdo it. All right, now let's look at one particular expression, right? This Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, the beginning of the blossoming of our redemption. So this was kind of a controversial statement. Right. So why do you think it might be a controversial statement? Who would it be controversial for?
My understanding that the Orthodox were not real happy with Zionism because it wasn't being initiated by God.
Right.
And,
yeah. So the Haredim, those who rejected the legitimacy of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, they didn't like this, right? Because this ties the political entity of Israel into this messianic story, right? But you know, this is a double smichut. Right, so what is a smichut? Is like a conjunction when you've got two nouns together, like school bus, right? So this one has two. Reshit tzmichat. So reshit is the beginning of, tzmichat is the blossoming of our redemption, the beginning of the blossoming of our redemption. So the language that Herzog chose to use here kind of puts in these two expressions, each of which convey that we're at the very, very beginning of something.
Of a process, maybe.
The process, yeah.
Right. So it's already got two qualifiers. And so I know some people throw in a third.
Yeah. So the third, and this appears in Siddur Lev Shalem, the newest conservative one, adds in brackets right before that the word shetaheh. All right. Shetaheh means that it may be. Right. And so, but it wasn't a conservative rabbi who put this in here. It says this Hebrew word was added by the chief rabbi of England, Emanuel Jacobowitz, turning the phrase the beginning of the flowering of the redemption into an expression of hope rather than a statement of fact, right? So it's almost like may Israel, may this kind of political, messy place be worthy of being the beginning of the flowering of redemption, right? Which places it, which is a less declarative, less definitive statement and more of an expression of hope or aspiration. All right. Any other questions about this one?
I have a question. Why we don't say this blessing every Shabbat? That's my question.
Mm.
Time.
It's very.
Well, maybe
not the
that's
whole thing.
why it's only one paragraph.
It's one paragraph.
That could be also, yeah. So it might be that it was shortened for time. You know, we've got 3 prayers in here. We've got prayer for country, prayer for Israel, prayer for peace. And yeah, we decided to go to a number of years ago to go to a 3-week rotation, just as one thing that we could do to cut time from our services, because they typically go longer than 3 hours, which is quite a long time to be in shul. But Sherry was going to write us a new prayer that combines
Yeah,
all three
right.
of them.
It's going to be 2 lines long, okay? Yeah. With my own new stuff too.
If you're under, there you go. You can compose the melody along with it.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So here we have just the one that's in our Siddur. So just keep in mind as well that in that original newspaper article, the instruction was that this prayer should be recited in all synagogues in Israel and in the diaspora. Right. That was their intention, for Jews to be reciting this everywhere. Of course, in Israel, they weren't reciting the prayer for the government anymore. Right. So in Israel, they just have one prayer to do, but in the diaspora, they've got two for us. And then in addition, I didn't include it here, but there is a prayer for those who are serving in the IDF as well. That is also included in many Siddurim. It's not in our Siddur, but a lot of Orthodox Siddurim include it, including outside of Israel. And now we're on to the next page. Leave it. So this prayer is called Birkat HaChodesh. All right. So blessing of the Chodesh, of the month. Chodesh is an interesting word because Chodesh means month, but it's also Chadash. It means new. Right. So it's the idea of the renewal every month of the moon. And Chodesh means moon as well on some occasions. So Rosh Chodesh, you could say, is the head of the month, or the head of the moon, the new moon. So something like that. So we have this prayer in our Siddurim. It's on 150. We did it just this past Shabbat, and this always occurs on the Shabbat prior to the Rosh Chodesh. So when the new moon will appear. And so it starts here. I always in shul, I always go through the choreography beforehand, but now I get to point to things. This is the first paragraph. So the first thing is that the congregation says this quietly to themselves. And then the Shaliach Tzibur, the leader, chants it out loud in Hebrew. And then the Shaliach Tzibur picks up the Torah and then recites this paragraph. And then right in this paragraph is when the Shaliach Tzibur announces the new moon and announces the name of the month and the day of the week, or the days of the week on which the Rosh Chodesh will be. And then the congregation repeats that line afterwards. And actually, and what we do is we repeat it in Hebrew and then read it in English. And actually, the reading in English is necessary. That's required because it's supposed to be read in the language that the people understand. We need to make sure that people know when Rosh Chodesh is going to be. And then finally, we have a closing blessing, which the congregation reads, and then the leader chants it out loud in Hebrew to finish things off. All right, but where did this come from? So where does Rosh Chodesh come from? Right. So it turns out in really ancient times, in ancient Israel, Rosh Chodesh was almost like a Shabbat. So it would be observed as a festive day, and it would people wouldn't work on it. And eventually that stopped, but its specialness continued. It was since ancient times associated as a women's holiday. So women would continue to not work on Rosh Chodesh, which is kind of interesting. I saw that in some ancient communities had a kiddush for Rosh Chodesh, just like we have a kiddush for Shabbat. But
so it's party day for all the women?
Yeah, a party day for all of them. I've even read from Bible scholars that are going way back. Rosh Chodesh preceded Shabbat as the day of rest, so that Shabbat really evolved out of the Rosh Chodesh tradition. So, but that's all ancient history for us. So where does this prayer come from? So Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Brachot 16b. We've seen this page before. If you recall, when we were studying the Amidah, we saw that at the very end of the Amidah, there is a prayer that's a kind of a personal meditation, right? It begins, Elohai netzor l'shoni me'ra, God, guard my lips from evil, my tongue from speaking lies, and then don't let anybody do any bad things to me, et cetera, et cetera. And we saw that prayer, and we saw that it originated as in a Talmud, and it was a particular prayer composed by a particular Talmudic sage that he would use that after the Amidah was over, because the end of the Amidah was a time for personal supplication. But in the Talmud, there are a number of different versions of prayers by different rabbis that appear in that context. Here's one of them. So this is Rav's prayer that he would use every day when he got to the end of the Amidah. So it begins, Rav Batar Tzlote Amar Hachi. So Rav, after his tefillah, after he finished saying the Amidah, Amar Hachi, he would say the following. Yirat Simel Fanecha Adonai Eloheinu, Shetitein Lanu Chaim Arukim. Right. So may be your will, Lord our God, that you grant us long life, a life of peace, a life of goodness, a life of blessing, a life of sustenance. All right, now this next expression, Shlomo, I'm going to ask your help here. Chaim shel chilutz atzamot, right? Here, this is Steinsaltz's translation. It says a life of freedom of movement. What is chilutz atzamot?
When you feel good, when all your bones, lechaletz is to take out, really, or to move.
Yeah, to move your bones.
I think it's a good feeling,
Yeah.
You stretch.
All right. It's like modern Hebrew is talking about exercises. So atzamot or bones, sorry. Then it goes, a life of dread of sin, or really fear of sin, a life without shame and disgrace, a life of wealth and honor, a life in which we have love of Torah and reverence for heaven, a life in which you fulfill all the desires of our heart for good. All right. Beautiful prayer. Anything stand out in this prayer?
I'm sorry, this is the blessing for the new month that came from the Babylonian Talmud,
this is Rav's prayer that he would recite at the end of the Amidah every day.
Every day, okay.
Right? So remember, the Amidah is all in the first person plural, right? So grant all of these things for us. And then at the end of the Amidah, it's an opportunity to ask for more individualistic things. Right? Although he actually keeps this in the plural as well. He says lanu, like for us.
It seems like it has everything in it.
It's got it, yeah. He captures it all. When he says chaim she'ein bahem busha uchlima, a life without shame and disgrace. What do you think he might mean there?
Could mean a lot of things.
Yeah, I don't know what he means. It could be, a sense maybe in his day Jews are being persecuted against, and so he doesn't want that, or maybe he just doesn't want to screw up and do something to embarrass himself. Or
well, he starts with sin, so maybe if you sin, you don't feel shame or disgrace.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, a bunch of possibilities, but of course, there's no mention of the new month.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
All right, so what do we do? Yiratzam milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu. Our Siddur adds Velohei Avotenu. our God and God of our ancestors. That wasn't in Rav's version. And then we add this, that you should renew for us this Chodesh, this month, or maybe this moon, l'tova v'livracha, for goodness and for blessing, right? So just with this one addition, we invoke this prayer, not as a daily prayer, but specifically as a prayer for Rosh Chodesh, for the new month. And it's nice. It's a lovely prayer, right? And maybe, when we're looking for things to put in the Siddur, we've got so many wonderful prayers in the Talmud written by these rabbis, and maybe we want to give honor to them. And so, right? We can't use all of them after every Amidah, but maybe we'll put Rav's prayer and modify it and use it at the for Rosh Chodesh, for announcing the new month.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did we mark Rosh Chodesh by doing those things like the equivalent of when it's Shabbat, when Shabbat ends, right? Did you have to go to the Sanhedrin and say that somebody saw something? Did we do that? And if we did, then how ancient, in fact, could the prayer have?
Okay, you're asking a good
holiday
question. Yes, and we're gonna come to that shortly. Actually, we can deal with that right now. So originally, the calendar is determined by the Sanhedrin sitting in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And so what they would do is witnesses would see the new moon, the first appearance of the new moon, and would go to Jerusalem, and they would give testimony, formal testimony. They'd be deposed as witnesses, and then if the Sanhedrin accepted the validity of their testimony, and if they were valid witnesses, then the Sanhedrin would declare mikudash, mikudash, which means sanctified, sanctified. And so they would declare that day to be Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the new month, right? The new month begins when the first sliver of the moon appears in the sky.
Oh, so not at the end. It's at the beginning.
Beginning, the first sliver of the moon, and
Well, I've
that,
always wondered how you can look up and see the new moon.
sorry.
Right.
How do you look up and see the new moon? Well, you see the first sliver of the new moon.
Yeah, and to make it complicated is that you can only see it late in the afternoon.
Yeah.
It only becomes visible late in the afternoon, and only for a very short period of time, because it tends to be, it's low on the horizon at that point. So it's difficult to do. And so they knew when it should appear, but based on, at least as the rabbis tell, based on their interpretation of the Torah, it says HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodeshim. This is in Exodus 12. This moon for you shall be the beginning of the months. And because it says for you, they understand that means it's up to human beings to determine the calendar, right? We can't just rely on calculation. We have to actually observe it. So which creates some problems, because there are special offerings, special sacrifices that have to be offered in Rosh Chodesh, and they have to be offered in the morning. So if there's no chance of seeing the new moon until the afternoon, and yet there are things that have to be offered in the morning, what do you do, right? So the answer is you offer them anyways. And if for some reason we're not able to receive the testimony of the witnesses in time, then it automatically makes the following day Rosh Chodesh. So every month, Rosh Chodesh could be on one of two different days. Right? If it's on the first day, we've got a 1-day Rosh Chodesh. If it's on the second day, we've got a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, because of the just-in-case sacrifices that are offered. Okay, but in any event, you have the Sanhedrin declaring, formally declaring Mikudash, Mikudash. Today is Rosh Chodesh. Now, interestingly, what we're doing here is the exact opposite. Right? Here, what we're doing is we're announcing in advance when Rosh Chodesh is going to be. So how can you do that? How can you announce in advance when Rosh Chodesh is going to be if it's reliant upon receiving the testimony of witnesses? So, and the answer is that we now have a fixed calendar. So sometime in the 3rd century, the, I guess, Jewish life, or at least the life of the Sanhedrin, had been declining in the land of Israel. And so they were no longer in a position to be able to meet and to hear from witnesses. Plus the community in Babylonia was increasing in its significance, and it had become more of the center of the Jewish world. But this meeting and declaration of the new month could only happen in the land of Israel. And so it's shifted over to a fixed calendar system. So in other words, it's based on calculation, right? We know the astronomy. Their math was quite good. They could predict with a high degree of accuracy exactly when that new moon would first appear in the sky. And so they built a Jewish calendar accordingly. A Hebrew month can have either 29 or 30 days in it, depending on if it's going to be a 1-day or a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. And if it's 30 days, we get a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. So it's day 1 would be the 30th day, and then day 2 would be the first day of the following month. Right, but this issue around the calendar was a huge issue in the Jewish world. The ability to control the authority to control the calendar is incredibly important, right? Wars have been fought over who gets to determine the calendar. Schisms within the Jewish world occurred over who gets to decide when the calendar, who gets to decide when the new month will occur. And it's very important from a religious perspective, because we need to know when Rosh Chodesh is if we're going to be able to observe the holidays on the correct day of the month, right? So Pesach is, the night of the 14th, right? So the 15th to the 21st of Nisan. If we don't know when Rosh Chodesh is, we don't know what the right day to observe Pesach is going to be on, and that's going to be really important. So so that's why it was so critical for the Sanhedrin to be receiving the witnesses, making its determination, and then sending messengers out to publicize that information to other Jews. So here, we're doing the opposite, right? Now, we're not even going to pretend that there's going to be receiving of witnesses. We are announcing in advance when Rosh Chodesh is going to be in the coming week. So why is that important for us to do?
In ancient time, it was very important because like the story in the Talmud about Rabbi Gamliel,
Yeah.
there were a big quarrel.
Yeah.
And because if you miss it, the Rosh Chodesh, you might work on Yom Kippur.
Right.
Just like that.
Right. Yeah. But in our day, we have a fixed calendar, right? I go at the beginning of the year and I get my Sunday Memorial Chapel gives out the calendar with pictures of cemeteries all over the place, right? So I can look up exactly when all these days. So this idea about publicly announcing when Rosh Chodesh is going to be doesn't have the same role that it had when we had a more variable calendar, right? And even in the early centuries, while they did it by calculation, that doesn't necessarily mean they could publish a calendar that had the next 500 years of holidays on it. There still might have been some variability. It seems that it wasn't until maybe the 10th century when we really fixed the calendar in the way that we have it now. So maybe it's an opportunity.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe it's an opportunity to call for blessings. We have this day, Rosh Chodesh, which is an opportunity it's a day of renewal, and so we can ask for all of these blessings. Maybe it also lets people know when during the week ahead when they should say Hallel and do the other things that they need to do on Rosh Chodesh religiously.
Am I wrong? Did you teach us that the months aren't named in the Bible? So what's named is the beginning of the month. So it'll be the first month, the 5th month. So the beginning of the month. So just really historically important because it's how we were centered.
Right. So
You
when
know what I'm saying?
in Exodus 12, when it says this HaChodesh zeh yeh lechem Rosh Chodeshim, so this Chodesh will be for you Rosh Chodeshim, it means moon. This moon will be for you the head of the moons. And they're referring to the moon of spring. So what we would call Nisan. Right. And so whenever the Torah gives us a date, it's always, in the third moon of the second year after Israel left Egypt.
Yeah.
Something to that. So that they're counting moons. So we have this lunar calendar. Except we have to have a solar adjustment periodically to make sure that the holidays all occur in the right seasons. All right, so now let's look at the next paragraph. So because Misha asa nisim la'avotenu, so that might sound familiar. The one who performed miracles for our ancestors. Sha'asa nisim la'avotenu bayamim. Right. So sounds like the Hanukkah blessing, right? V'ga'al otam me'avdut l'cherut, and redeemed them from slavery to freedom. Now we get a little Pesach reference, perhaps. Hu yigal otanu bekarov. May he redeem us soon. V'kabetz nidachenu me'arba kanfot ha'aretz, and gather in our exiles from the four corners of the earth. Another reference there. Although this prayer definitely predates the establishment of Israel. And then Chaverim kol Yisrael v'nomar amen. Chaverim is friends, right? Friends kol Yisrael are all of Israel, and let us say amen. So this expression Chaverim kol Yisrael, in Sim Shalom it translates it in the fellowship of the entire people Israel. I saw another translation that said all of Israel are connected. Does that ring a bell? Yeah.
Kol Yisrael arevim ze lazeh.
Right. So Kol Yisrael arevim ze lazeh is an expression. Arevim chaverim sound very similar. I've not seen anybody make the connection directly, but to me it seems obvious. And I'm wondering even if there may have been a typo or something, but the expression Kol Yisrael arevim ze lazeh, all of Israel, arevim means are surety or collateral, right? So when Judah tells Jacob, their father, that he's going to take personal responsibility for Benjamin, that's what he says. He says, I'm going to be arev, right? I'm going to be collateral. I'm going to be the guarantor for Benjamin's life, right? And so this idea that Jews are responsible for one another in that way, that's an important concept of Klal Yisrael. Only here it doesn't say Arevim Kol Yisrael, it says Chaverim Kol Yisrael, which is also nice, right? All of maybe aspirational. All of Israel are friends. And then we get to the announcement, Rosh Chodesh, so the new month of, and then we name it. So this past Shabbat we said Iyar, and then Yeh B'Yom will be on, and then we announced the day of the week. So here it was, this past week we announced Yom Sheni v'Yom Shlishi, which is Monday and Tuesday, which means today is Rosh Chodesh. So happy Rosh Chodesh. Chodesh Tov.
This is party day. Okay.
Yeah. And Haba Aleinu Vel Kol Yisrael Tova. May it come upon us and upon all of Israel for good. Right now, we would use this announcement if Rosh Chodesh was going to be on any day from Sunday through the following Shabbat. So if Rosh Chodesh is next Shabbat, we would say Yeh B'Yom Shabbat Kodesh. So it will be on Shabbat, the Holy Sabbath. Now, sometimes there are two, like as we did just this past Shabbat, we announced a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. So if we're doing a 2-day Rosh Chodesh starting next Shabbat, we would say Yeh B'Yom Shabbat Kodesh umacharato yom rishon, right? So it will be on next Holy Sabbath and its following day, Sunday. So that's what we would say. And then we finish up with this closing blessing, Yichadeshehu, right? You may see the word Chodesh in there. Yichadeshehu means renew it, right? May the Holy Blessed One renew it for us and for all of his people, the house of Israel. And we say L'chaim L'shalom, and then the congregation says Amen. So Chaim and Shalom, life and peace. Sason Simcha, joy and gladness. Amen. And Liyeshua L'nechama, for salvation and for consolation, for comfort. V'nomar Amen. We say Amen. And this entire prayer is done in kind of a very formal, kind of almost like a royal kind of setting. Everybody stands up. You know, we're holding the Torah. The melody is supposed to. The nusach is very regal and in a major key. So like when we get to the ending part, Yichadeshehu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aleinu Ve'al Kol Amo Beit Yisrael L'chaim L'shalom
Amen.
L'sason L'simcha L'yeshua L'nechama V'nomar Amen. Right. So in keeping with the melody of the rest of the Torah service, it's kind of has this very grandiose kind of musical quality to it. So, all right. Any questions?
The reform only announced one day, not a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. And I'm wondering what they do in Israel.
Oh no, it's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh.
Okay.
Yeah, because the announcement of Rosh Chodesh was Rosh Chodesh could, back when the temple stood, Rosh Chodesh could be on one of 2 days, and so it would be observed as either a 1 or a 2-day event in the temple. Right, so they, just in case, since we didn't know going into any end of month period, we didn't know when the Sanhedrin would receive testimony. So just in case, they had to observe the first possible day as Rosh Chodesh, starting already early that morning. And so it might be that they wouldn't, the Sanhedrin wouldn't have declared Rosh Chodesh that day, and then we would have done all of these Rosh Chodesh rituals, even though tomorrow is going to be Rosh Chodesh and we have to do it again.
And they kept to that practice even after the calendar got fixed?
Yes, because we still need, it's called a ibur, which is intercalation, which means adding a day. So we have some months are intercalated. So an intercalated month, actually the Hebrew word is ibur, which means pregnant. Right, so a pregnant month is a month in which there are 30 days instead of 29 days. Right, an intercalated year is a year in which there are 13 months instead of 12 months.
I'm familiar with the term there.
Yeah, and so so this is how the calendar is adjusted to make sure, because these are all round numbers, right? We can't have a portion of a day. So meaning we're going to have to make adjustments, because what is it, 29 and a little bit less than a half is the actual length of a month. So we have to make adjustments, right? So some months get the adjustment, other months don't get the adjustment. When it was based on observation, you didn't know going from one month to the next whether it would be adjusted or not. Once we have a fixed calendar, we do know. We have a fixed 19-year cycle. So for every year in that 19-year cycle, certain months are going to have 29 days and certain months will have 30 days. I don't know the specifics, but there are some months that always have 30 days and there's others that always have 29 days. And part of that has to do with making sure that certain holidays occur or don't occur on certain days of the week, right? So there's some manipulation of the calendar to avoid certain kind of inconvenient days that holidays might occur on, which means that actually sometimes we end up with the actual Rosh Chodesh, the Molad, which means that's the word for the first appearance of the moon, occurring on a day other than either of the Rosh Chodesh days, because the calendar's been manipulated so much in order to get things fixed. But overall, over 19 years, it all evens itself out. And it is a remarkably accurate calendar, in terms of not needing to have any extra days added onto the calendar. Although at some point we will have to do that.
Yeah. We've slid enough now that we can't have Hanukkah and Thanksgiving on the same day again.
Right, exactly. Unless we don't make any adjustments for the next 90,000 years. But at some point we're going to have to make an adjustment. So. All right, Romeo asked a question. If we do the rotation of the moon, did the rabbis in the past understand that the earth was round? Well, the ancient Greeks knew it was round. I mean, Ptolemy figured out that it was round, and to a pretty high degree of accuracy predicted the circumference of the earth. So that knowledge was certainly out there. But even if you think that it's flat, you can still calculate the orbits of the moon and the planets and the position of the sun in the sky. The math still works out if you assume a flat earth.
Okay.
Right. But like Maimonides in the 12th century, in the Mishnah Torah, one of the sections of the Mishnah Torah is all about the calendar. It's the sanctification of the month is the name of that section. It's 20 chapters long, and he's the first person in Jewish history to actually write down the math of the calendar, and he does it with incredible accuracy. And he knows about latitude and longitude, and he knows about the issues about when the moon's going to appear at a certain time in Jerusalem, but it's going to appear at a different time if you're in Spain, or if you're at a different time if you're in Babylonia. And so he actually provides math formulas to make the calculation depending on where you are. And he also gives ways to predict, let's say if the Molad, the new month of any given month during the year, occurs at such and such a time. If you want to go forward X number of years and X number of months, you'll be able to predict exactly when the Molad will occur at that later date. And so the accuracy is pretty remarkable. And Maimonides bases it not on his own observations exclusively, but he bases it on some other kind of Arab astronomers of his day. But he applies all of that to the Jewish calendar system. Okay. So whether Maimonides thought the earth was round or not, I don't know.
Okay.
Well, they should know it's circular because of the shadow the earth casts on the moon during an eclipse. It doesn't say that it's a ball.
All right, so here's what Maimonides does say. He knows, so there are classically, and we actually studied this a bit when we looked at El Adon, that there were heavenly bodies that orbit around the earth, right? And so you've got so he thought that the sun orbited the earth, goes around the earth,
there.
and that the planets, the stars, the constellations also orbited around the earth. But he knew that the planets could not be orbiting around the earth because the math didn't work out, right? And so, but his calculation, he says that the planets orbit around some spot between the sun and earth. And that
Not
so we
wrong.
already had a sense that the planets are going around something that wasn't, geocentric.
I have a question about we just finished Pesach, and the last day of Pesach in the diaspora is an extra day.
Mhm.
In Israel, it's one day less. Is it has anything to do with this kind of calculation?
It has to do with, so back when the temple stood and they were doing the calculation, and they weren't doing calculations, they were basing it upon observation. So they would send out messengers from the temple to let people know when the new month occurred, so that they would know for their calendars when the holidays would be. And so if a community was too far away to receive the messengers, then they would have a problem, because they wouldn't know which of the two possible days Rosh Chodesh was declared on. And so in order to cover their bases, they would have to observe 2 days of Yom Tov. And that's where the kind of the extra day of Yom Tov in the diaspora, that's where it came from. Now, once they started doing it by calculation, though, you would think that would no longer be an issue, right? Because now we're not reliant upon observation, right? We can calculate. We should be able to publish a calendar and know exactly when it is. And in fact, it seems that there are some in Babylonia that in fact went back to a single day of Yom Tov because of that. And then in the Talmud, there is recorded a letter that was sent from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, which instructed them to return to observing the extra day of Yom Tov. Why? Because it might be the case in the future that the authorities in the land of Israel would crack down and would prevent the Sanhedrin to meet and to fix the calendar, and that the knowledge of how to do so would become lost. And then we would have to go back to relying upon observation. And if we're going back to rely on observation, then you in the diaspora are going to have to observe 2 days of the festival, because you won't get the news in time. And so it's better to continue the custom of your ancestors in observing 2 days in the event that such a crackdown were to occur, and the knowledge of how to calculate the new month would be lost.
But today everything is predicted,
Well, so that is the reason that we observe 2 days in the diaspora. It's the reason that's given in the Talmud. It is the reason that Maimonides says observe 2 days in the diaspora. The Shulchan Aruch reiterates it and says in the diaspora you got to do it. And if anybody who thinks they should only do one, they should be stopped from doing so, or they should you shouldn't listen to them, right? But the irony is that the whole premise of it is based on two things. One, we lose the knowledge of how to calculate when the new moon will appear, and two, we don't have the ability to communicate quickly. We're reliant on horse or foot-bound travelers in order to communicate the news, right? That's why we have 2 days in the diaspora. So if you ask me, should we be observing 2 days of Yom Tov in the diaspora? The answer is no, we should not be. Because not only is the premise upon which we do it, I think quite false. And if human civilization gets so bad that we forget that knowledge, we're gonna have a lot of other problems to deal with also. But not only that, the Torah says, one of the laws in the Torah is Bal Tosif, which is you're not allowed to add or take away, Bal Tigra, from any of this, it's in the Torah. And the rabbis understand Bal Tosif and Bal Tigra to mean anything that is enumerated, right? So anything where we've got a specific number attached with it, you can't add an extra number. or reduce a number. So we've got 4 species for Sukkot. You can't take 3 species. You can't take 5 species, right? You've got to you got to live in your Sukkot for, for 7 days. You're not allowed to sleep in there the 8th day, right? Right, because that would be and changing the number of the number that's articulated in the Torah. So what do? Is we add an extra day of Yom Tov, right? Which means that we're saying all sorts of brachot, extra brachot for that day of Yom Tov, which seems to be a violation of Bal Tosif, which is a Torah law, and we're doing it based on something that is really a minhag, right? And it's a minhag based upon something that is questionable. So if it were up to me by myself, I'd get rid of the extra day.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do that on my own. I'm not going to go against what is commonly practiced in the Jewish world, and including in conservative synagogues. But and even the Hasidim, even they know, because on the 8th day of Pesach, Hasidim, who normally don't eat what are called gebrochts, which is matzah that has been in water. So think matzah ball soup, right? Matzah meal boiled in water, right? So it's not chametz, but nevertheless, their custom is to not eat gebrochts during Pesach, except on the 8th day they have gebrochts. So Hasidim will have matzah ball soup on the 8th day of Pesach. So
very interesting.
That's my diatribe on the calendar.
Wow, you know a lot.